If you're a black kid from Generation X who got bused into a white school, one sound still lives somewhere in your chest. It's your own name being butchered on the very first day of class. You remember the pause before the teacher even tried, that little breath she took, like your name was a problem she hadn't studied for. The snickers rippled through rows of desks that didn't look like your street, and that whole morning comes back to you in pieces. There was the stiff new collar your mother ironed the night before, and the way she checked your part one more time at the door. She gave you a quiet instruction to be on your best behavior, and somehow that felt heavier than any homework assignment. That memory pulls up another one right behind it, of standing at the bus stop before the sun was even all the way up. You can still feel the cold seeping through your good shoes while you waited with 2 or 3 kids from the block. All of you were dressed a little too carefully for people about to ride an hour just to sit in a classroom. Some of you talk about that bus ride like it was its own country, a rolling border between two worlds. On one side, you were simply yourself, and on the other side waited a version of you that had to be decided mile by mile. Today, we're sliding back into that particular ache and that particular pride. It's the strange in-between feeling of growing up black in classrooms that were never really built with you in mind. This is for anyone who learned to speak one way at school and another way at grandma's table. It's for anyone who got called articulate like it was a surprise, who carried 2 versions of themselves in the same backpack every day. Something about the way your teacher said your name or the way your mother packed your lunch a little differently is probably surfacing right now. Later on, we're going to sit with the sting of being the only one in a classroom picture and the quiet relief of finally getting home. Tell me where you grew up, what generation you belong to, and what the first memory is that just came rushing back. But right now, let's stay with that bus ride a little longer, because that's usually where it all begins. Once you got off that bus and walked through the doors, the first thing that hit you wasn't the lessons, it was the silence that fell when you walked into a room, a silence that had its own particular weight. You'd scan the rows of desks without even meaning to, counting how many faces looked like yours. Most days, the answer was one, or none at all. The smell of a school like that stays with you too, that mix of pencil shavings and floor wax and something faintly like cafeteria milk. It was so different from the smell of your own kitchen that it almost felt like visiting another country every morning. You remember teachers who looked right past you when hands went up, or how your correct answer somehow needed double checking in a way nobody else's did. Small moments like that seemed like nothing on their own, but they added up to something you couldn't name yet.
Underneath all of it was a feeling of having to prove you belonged there, a low hum of pressure the other kids never seemed to carry. That feeling didn't stay locked in the classroom either, because it followed you right out into the hallway. Somebody's hand always seemed to find its way into your hair before you could flinch away. The hair questions have their own separate file in your memory, filed right next to the awkward laughter you gave back because you didn't know what else to do. "Can I touch it?" they'd ask. And sometimes they didn't even ask, they just reached, like your head was a petting zoo exhibit set out for their curiosity. You learned early how to make your face go still while your stomach turned over, how to laugh along so nobody would call you too sensitive. That always circled back to picture day, that one day a year when the whole building lined up in the gym for photos. You'd stand there, acutely aware you were often the only black face in your entire homeroom's row. Looking at those class photos now, decades later, you can pick yourself out instantly. It's not because you were smiling the biggest, but because you looked like you were working the hardest to seem like you belonged. That particular kind of loneliness, dressed up in a cardigan and a forced smile, is a very specific ache only kids like you carry from that era. The night before those pictures, your mother or your auntie would sit you on a stool between their knees, working through your hair with a rat tail comb. You could smell the blue magic hair grease before you even saw the jar, that thick, sweet scent that meant somebody loved you enough to get it exactly right. There was a particular sting to the parting, a tug that made your eyes water, even though you knew better than to say anything about it. And underneath that sting was something steadying, the knowledge that somebody was taking real care with how the world would see you the next morning. School hallways weren't the only place carrying that tension, because even the curriculum had a way of making you feel like a guest in your own history. February would roll around and suddenly you were the designated expert on your people, expected to explain slavery or civil rights while 30 faces turned to stare at you. You remember the exhaustion of being 12 years old and somehow responsible for an entire race in a classroom discussion. Nobody ever asked if you wanted that job in the first place. That kind of pressure has a way of following a kid home, sitting on their chest at the dinner table, even when nobody there is asking them to explain anything. And strangely enough, home is exactly where that pressure would finally lift, the second you walked through your own front door. I still remember one afternoon coming home from that school with a knot in my stomach I couldn't quite explain to my mother. Something about a comment a classmate made, and I didn't have the words for it yet. She didn't ask me to explain it fully. She just sat me down at the kitchen table and put a plate in front of me. She went to quiet, do most of the talking while I picked at my food. It wasn't until years later that I understood what she was actually doing in that moment. She was giving me a soft place to land without forcing me to perform my pain for her approval. That afternoon taught me, without a single lecture, that home could be the one place where I didn't have to translate myself for anybody else's comfort. I carried that lesson quietly for years, long after I'd forgotten the exact words that classmate said to set it off. And that feeling of finally exhaling once I crossed my own threshold pulls me right back into what home actually felt like during those years. Home had its own rhythm that stood in direct contrast to the stiffness of that school building.
It started with the sound of the screen door slapping shut behind you the second you walked in. Your grandmother's kitchen usually had something going on the stove already, and the smell alone made your shoulders drop for the first time all day. You'd hear cousins laughing from another room, the television playing something like Good Times or later Family Matters. The whole house felt like it was breathing at a completely different pace than the classroom you just left. Sunday dinners were their own kind of sanctuary, the table crowded with dishes that told you exactly whose house you were in. In that space, you didn't have to explain your hair, your name, or your history to anyone at all, because everybody already understood it in their bones. That understanding is what made church the next morning feel like a natural continuation of the same warmth, instead of a separate obligation stacked onto your week. Church mornings carried their own sensory memory, from the stiff patent leather shoes pinching your toes to the choir warming up before service even officially started. You remember the particular hush that fell right before the pastor stepped up, followed by a sudden amen that seemed to shake the whole sanctuary a week. The women's perfume mixed with the smell of Sunday dinner already simmering back home. Somehow that combination became the unofficial scent of belonging for an entire generation of kids like you. Sitting in those pews, surrounded by people who called each other sister and brother without any irony, gave you a version of community the school hallways never once offered. That feeling of being fully seen, fully known, without having to shrink or perform is something you carried into every other room afterward. And somehow, that same sense of being known is what made the fellowship hall afterward feel like an extension of the same warmth. Folding tables would fill up with sheet cake and sweet tea, and grown folks would talk over each other in a way that felt like music you could actually understand. Kids darted between legs while the adults traded news about who got a new job and whose grandbaby just started walking. All of it was woven together like nobody in that room had anywhere else they needed to be. That unhurried Sunday afternoon is what made summers with your cousins feel like the truest version of freedom you'd ever experienced. Summer meant the school year's tension finally released its grip. It was replaced by the sound of an ice cream truck's jingle drifting down a block full of kids who all looked like you. You and your cousins would run outside the second the streetlights weren't on yet, playing games that never required translation for anybody watching. Double Dutch ropes slapped the pavement while somebody's radio played whatever was on the charts that summer. And the Kool-Aid always tasted a little too sweet because nobody ever measured the sugar exactly right. Those summers had an ease to them that school never allowed, a total absence of the low hum of pressure that had become so normal it almost felt invisible. Looking back now, you understand those blocks and porches were doing quiet repair work on something the classroom had been chipping away at all year long. And that repair work is exactly what made going back to school every September feel like stepping back into a costume you'd almost managed to shed. That back-to-school feeling brings up something else entirely, the code switching that became so automatic you barely noticed yourself doing it by middle school. You learned to soften your voice a certain way for teachers and to laugh a little quieter than you would at home. You chose your words like you were walking across a floor you weren't sure would hold your weight. Then the bus would drop you back at the corner, and within half a block, your whole voice would change again. Your shoulders loosened and your slang came right back like it had never left in the first place. That switch became so fluid that most of you didn't even clock it as exhausting until you got older and realized how much energy it had actually taken. Psychologists have a name for that now, but back then it was just Tuesday, just the price of admission to spaces that were never designed with your comfort in mind. And that quiet exhaustion is part of why finding even one teacher who saw you clearly felt like striking gold in the middle of a very long desert. The cafeteria had its own version of that same exhaustion, playing out every single day at lunchtime without anybody having to say a word about it.
You noticed how the tables sorted themselves without any teacher ever assigning seats, and how you'd scan the room the way you scanned the classroom on your very first day. If there was another black kid anywhere in that lunchroom, you found them and you sat right down beside them. It felt like you'd known each other your whole lives, even if you'd only just met that morning. That table became its own small country too, a place where you could finally let your shoulders drop in the middle of a school day. Nobody had to explain a joke there. Nobody had to translate a reference. And for 25 minutes, you got to just be a kid instead of a representative of anything. Every kid from that era seems to remember one teacher, one counselor, one adult in that building who actually looked at them and saw a whole person. Maybe it was Mrs. Johnson who kept an extra granola bar in her desk drawer, or Mr. Reynolds who pulled you aside just to ask how you were really doing. That adult's attention had a way of patching something up inside you that the rest of the building had been quietly unraveling all year. You remember exactly what their classroom smelled like, exactly where they sat, exactly the tone of their voice when they said something as simple as, "You did good today." That kind of recognition mattered more than any grade you ever brought home. It told you that you were seen as a whole child, not just a statistic filling out an integration quota. And carrying that memory of being truly seen eventually leads you to the quieter, harder memory that still sits at the center of it all. I still remember one afternoon, much later, sitting across from my own mother as a grown woman. I finally asked her what it had really cost her to send me to that school. She got quiet for a long moment, the kind of quiet that told me she'd been carrying an answer for years and had simply never been asked. She told me she knew exactly what she was sending me into every single morning. Some nights, she admitted, she cried after I went to sleep, terrified she was asking too much of a child who hadn't chosen any of it. Hearing that broke something open in me, because I had always assumed she never fully understood what those hallways felt like from the inside. In that moment, I realized love sometimes looks like sending your child into rooms that will hurt them, simply because the alternative offered even less of a future. That conversation is the one I keep coming back to now, decades later, whenever I think about what it truly meant to grow up the way we did. Looking back on all of it now, as an adult who survived those hallways and those Sunday dinners both, something finally comes into focus. You can see the whole shape of what was actually happening to you back then. The two selves you carried, the school self and the home self, weren't a flaw in your character. They were a survival skill your community handed down without ever calling it that out loud. every cousin who taught you a handshake was quietly building a foundation, and so was every grandmother who fed you without asking questions. So was every pastor whose sermon made the whole sanctuary rise to its feet, all of it preparing you to walk back into those hallways the next Monday. You understand now that the exhaustion you felt wasn't weakness, it was the ordinary cost of navigating two worlds that were never designed to speak to each other. And you understand, too, that the joy you found in between, the ice cream truck, the choir, the smell of Sunday dinner, wasn't just relief, it was the very thing that made you whole enough to keep going. If any of this stirred something loose in you, I'd love to hear about it, because these memories only get richer when we trade them back and forth. Maybe it's the sound of a specific bus route, or the smell of a specific kitchen, or maybe it's the name of a teacher you haven't thought of in 20 years until this very moment. Some of the stories shared here might even shape what we talk about next time, so don't hold back the small details that feel too ordinary to mention. If this conversation felt like sitting on a porch with an old friend, go ahead and subscribe so we can keep having these conversations together. And if you're ready for another one of these memories, stay close, because there's a whole other porch waiting for us just around the corner.